impact to plant diversity of fire and grazing.
Thank you, Marcos. I'm going to start my screen share. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
In 2020, I joined an expedition to study the high elevation grasslands of the Drakensberg Mountains. This was led by Stephen Sylvester and co-hosted by Vincent Ralph Clark, a South African native. We did field work from February 1 to March 10 in 2020. This is a view into the Eastern Cape province from the highest point, the highest pass in South Africa, Ben McDwee. Just grasslands forever. We have a paper in review in biodiversity and conservation led by Stephen Sylvester called The Resilience of Afro-Alpine Vegetation to Grazing and Burning, a case study of the grasses from the Drakensberg Mountain Center, or DCM, of Southern Africa. Stephen currently works in the College of Biology and Environment in Nanjing Forestry University. He got his PhD in 2015 in Zurich, working on the flora of high elevation vegetation, Puna vegetation in Peru, comparing ecosystems at different levels of anthropogenic disturbance. So he spent a lot of time mountain climbing up to places that nobody had ever been, and they weren't grazed. And then he compared that with other areas. Stephen is British and married Mitzi from Peru. Jacob, you'll see in this show a couple of times, was then almost 4. He's their son, and he probably caught more frogs than any kid ever wanted to catch. Stephen and I met after he sent me some collections from his Peru research for identification, one of which turned out to be a new species. After that, he worked after his PhD, he worked with the Royal Botanical Gardens Kew from 2017 to 18, working on floristics and ecology of the paramo vegetation of Colombia. I joined the team there for 6 weeks in 2018, where we team taught a grass taxonomy course and did field work. Currently, as I said, he's a professor, associate professor in China. Stephen's published over 30 research papers, and mostly on grasses, 11 of which we've collaborated on. He visited the Smithsonian Department of Botany in the winters of 2018 and 2020. And he did all the statistics and analyses reported here and basically wrote the paper with our advice. Anyway, Vincent Ralph Clark is our South African host. He's the pioneer director of the Afro-Montane Research Unit in the Kwakwa campus of Hobby, if you can say that, and good luck. It's a tongue twister, at the University of the Free State. This research unit is located at the foot of the highest mountains in Africa, south of Kilimanjaro, called the Malati Drakensberg, or just the Drakensberg to most of us. Other than driving a competent multidisciplinary mountain research team and international collaborations, Dr. Clark's personal research expertise focuses on the Southern African mountain plant diversity and endemism. He and his family live in Harry Smith, South Africa, and were our hosts when we were not out in the field. Ralph got interested in Stephen Sylvester's research program on high elevation grasslands in China and the Andes and invited him to develop a collaborative project in the Drakensberg. Long story short, Stephen wrote up a project and invited me to join him there. Organization of the talk is, I'll talk about the background of the region, first with the geology, climate, vegetation, and grazing and burning in grasslands. And I'll talk about the design of the study, the plot design, the variable studied, map of the major plot locations, and then present some formal results of responses to the alpine vegetation, to grazing and burning and other vectors. And if I have time, I'll bring up a couple additional notes on the Drakensberg flora. The Drakensberg Mountains are remnants of Jurassic basalt flows now sloping down westward. These overlay cave sandstone and lower bedrocks. The highest peaks reach over 3,400 meters. Tugela Falls is the second tallest falls in the world. It drops 983 meters from a 3,000 meter top. This rugged terrain is the backdrop for the movie The Black Panther. Tugela Falls drops off right there below Sentinel Peak. Looking down from the top of the falls on the Tugela Plateau, the falls go down in a series of 5 cascades through some pretty dramatic scenery. The tall grass at the base here along the rim is Merckx rulera, a genus in the subfamily Danthoniidae. The Southern African rainfall is generally in the winter in the west and summer monsoonal in the east and north. The Kingdom of Lesotho resides on a sky island inside of South Africa, rimmed by the Moloti Drakensberg Mountains. The geology of Lesotho is mostly sandstones in the west and basalts in south and east. Southern Africa has three major rainfall regimes: Mediterranean coastal in the Southwest Cape region with mild wet winters and dry summers. And north of there has increasing aridity to the northwest in the Karoo up to Namibia, which has desert with minimal precipitation. The climate is monsoonal in the east and north, diminishing westward and absent from the far west and southwest. Winters in the east and north are dry. The climate of the Drakensberg varies from east to west, with the west being drier and lower with decreasing monsoon impacts westward. Monsoons typically start off in mid-November and decline after January. Periodic droughts are increasing in frequency with La Nina events. For the 3 years prior to our 2019-20 summer expedition, the monsoon seasons have been very dry. Rains were very heavy in 2019-2020 and continued well into February. The precipitation regime, in combination with varied topography and substrates and coastlines on the Indian Ocean and South Africa, South Atlantic, combined to produce diverse biomes. In this map, the green area is called grassland, and that's what they call the veld. It's a treeless landscape dominated by grasses. The monsoons basically come across from the Indian Ocean across to the northwest and create savanna habitat, which is also a grassland. The Southern African monsoon dependent grasslands can be divided into three major types: savanna, tropical, dry, monsoonal dependent, with open forest and a C4 grass understory. There's something called the Sweetveld, which is treeless expanses entirely dominated by C4 grasses, adapted to hot summers with monsoons and cold, dry winters. The Sauerveld is a treeless montane grasslands with mixtures of C3 and C4 grasses, grading up into the alpine dominated by C3 grasses, all responding to monsoons and cold, frigid winters, sometimes with significant snowfalls. Here's a view from Plattsburgh, a basalt-topped tableland over Harrismith, South Africa, looking south towards the Drakensberg across the Sweetveld at around 1,800 meters. The Sweetveld is dominated by C4 grasses and extensively grazed and cyclically burned. While we were there, we collected lots of grasses, and these are the genera we collected from. Those we found in the Drakensberg Mountain Center Alpine have an asterisk next to them. The blue ones are C3 grasses. They have C3 photosynthesis. Nothing special there. The red ones have C4 photosynthesis, which adapts them to hot, dry, or humid summer rainfall. But C3s don't do well in that kind of climate. The C4s, all these grasses are divided into subfamilies. There are actually 12 subfamilies in the family. There's one bamboo, a couple of rice relatives, a bunch of Danthonioideae, and then a lot of Poloideae, the cool season grasses. In the C4s, we have Aristidoideae, Panicoideae, and Chloridoideae. A lot of the mountain alpine grasses have endemic species in the Drakensberg Mountain Center. Those are pointed out on the left. There are also some introduced exotic ones like Jarava and Misella coming from South America, which are expanding around South Africa, and they're quite worried about them. None of the C4 grasses are actually endemic to the Alpine or to the Drakensberg. They're more widespread throughout Africa. Most Lesotho villages are below 2,200 meters, the upper limit for growing crops there. Grazing is intense in the highlands and throughout the country by cattle, sheep, goats, and horses, and the grasslands are routinely burned in the dry season. Here we are on the Tugela Plateau again at 3,000 meters with some Basotho sheep herders watching on as we put out one of our first plots. This zone has got moderate grazing, and here you can see our plots are 2 by 2 meters bounded by this red cord. You can see some of these grasses are nipped off. The grasses are doing okay there, but they're smaller in size than what you'd find in a less grazed system. Overgrazing and erosion are serious problems in the Lesotho highlands. Once the soil is gone, there is no return. Overgrazing leads to erosion, precludes burning, and encourages increase in species and invasive species. Horses are commonly put on high pastures and overgraze them. They pull up plants versus slicing them off as sheep and cattle do. Grasslands are dynamic ecosystems. To maintain them in a healthy and diverse and productive state today requires understanding the prehistoric regimes of herbivores and predators and fire cycles and characteristics of the component plant and animal species. These overlain by current cultural practices and damage done by overgrazing. Prehistorically, large herds of native grazers lived in the Drakensberg, migrated up and down with the seasons, including mountain zebras, the separate species of zebra, which nearly went extinct. Electrical storms are common in the monsoon season and start many fires where there is vegetation to carry them. Eland were once common in the Drakensberg, and here were reintroduced in Lahania National Park, here in the Leucosidia forest in Lesotho. In Bokong National Reserve, Lesotho, burning is practiced on a rotational basis and domestic grazing is discouraged. Here you can see some mountain reed buck. In unburned climax grasslands, diversity tends to be low. Here we can see Festuca and caprina and Festuca drakensbergensis, and not much else. Grasses have very deep roots in the perennials, and most of the mass of the grass is actually underground. Old wolfy tussock grasses are avoided by grazing animals, which then focus on more sensitive species and individuals. Burning helps to level the field and recycle nutrients. This is Festuca caprina. Burning removes the wolfy plants and encourages release of many native species that respond to the nutrient cycling and openings in the vegetation.
Rob, what are wolfy plants? I'm sorry.
Wolfy plants are old plants that just have lots of dead vegetation on them, and the animals don't like that. They just ignore them. So you saw some very old festucas there. Those were wolfy plants. We observed increases in herbaceous species in burned areas. We saw lots of different orchid species among other groups. Here you can see Satyrium, Holothrix, and Dissa. Some other orchids are Houtonia and Satyrium, and I threw in a Hebenstretia of this Crossculariaceae as a rather interesting looking flower. For our 2x2 meter plots, we recorded lots of characteristics, including elevation, slope, aspect, percent rock, bare soil, and litter, proximity to the closest path, animal disturbance, dung presence, grazing and birding regimes of low, medium, and high, and their frequency, percent plant cover, canopy and shrub cover, canopy, shrub height, cover for each grass species, total grass cover, number of non-grass vascular plant species, number and name or field names of grass taxa present, and total species richness. All plots were photographed and grass taxa were vouchered. Our 220 2x2 meter plots were clustered within 25 sites, the green squares, all between 2,235 and 3,364 meters elevation. We ran 5 plots in most of these sites. There are a lot of C3 grasses out there. These are some of the genera. Merx mulera and Tanaxia are in the Danthonioideae. These aren't grazed easily. The animals don't like to eat them, and they increase when other grasses are eaten out by overgrazing. Festuca drakensbergensis was a new species we described after examining all our collections and reviewing Festuca collections in Pretoria. The Festuca species were difficult to work out. We ended up recognizing 2 varieties, 1 overlooked species, 1 new species, and 1 first record of an exotic species for the region. We published a couple of papers. We also found 4 exotic poa species not previously recorded for South Africa or Lesotho. We spent 2 weeks in Pretoria at the PRE Herbarium, and then Stephen and family spent 2 more months in COVID lockdown in the Clark family home in Harrismith, identifying our 350 collections, most basilica dried leaves for DNA extraction, and exploring the plot data. We found quite a few Festucas in South Africa, a couple that don't really belong in Festuca in the strict sense. Among the C4 genera, we collected Catalepus and Stiburus, 2 African C4 genera that Paul places in Eragrostis. Poa binata is a C3 grass, a common tussock grass in the Drakensberg. It tolerates burning and moderate grazing, but disappears under overgrazing. And even under moderate grazing, the plants become rather small and scattered. Here you can see Stephen, Jacob, and Mitzi Sylvester scoring a plot above the Tiffendale ski area in the Eastern Cape province. Some years they don't get any snow, but it's cold enough they can make snow with the water down in those ponds. We gathered bioclimatic data for each plot from worldclim.org. These were then evaluated for their importance and independence, and red variables were used to compare our plots. So mean annual temperature, isothermality, temperature seasonality, annual precipitation, and precipitation of the wettest month were important factors. We did statistics on these, and a number of these factors, including ecotype, grazing regime, and burning regime, were significant factors in comparisons between natives and regional natives and local endemics, and among all grasses and aliens. So there's a lot of significant variables here. We used constrained correspondence analysis, or CCA, for scaling grass community competition and spreading out our plots and displaying key vectors associated with plot community diversity. CCA of grass community composition retrieved a large cluster of plots of mixed grazing and burning regimes with no particular environmental vector associated with them. Other smaller groups of plots were separated from these associated with heavy grazing, bioclimatic variables, slope, gradient, and aspect. Here's the CCA of community competition with shrubs. Grasslands are squares, shrubs are triangles, and wetlands are circles. You can see that the grassland, the shrublands and wetlands pull away from the grasslands. You can also see that grazing was high in the ones that pulled away from the grass cluster, and low in the grasslands by comparison were moderate. Burning was high in the grasses because there's plenty of fuel to carry a fire. Moderate in the shrublands and wetlands. Wetlands partly because they have more moisture and they don't burn so readily. So burning was high in the grasslands. The high grazing shifted the composition within ecotypes. To identify grass species characteristic of each ecotype, grazing regime, and burning regime, indicator species analyses were performed using the INVAL method. DCM endemics, this group, the middle tone gray, dominated in grasslands and shrublands where grazing was low. Aliens, the very dark colored, very dark gray, increased where grazing was high and burning was low. Burning's low because there's no fuel to carry the fires. Wide-ranging natives, mostly the C4 grasses that have wide ranges, dominated in the wetlands and generally where grazing was moderate and were unaffected by burning. Plant species richness, the number of species, was highest under the moderate grazing and burning, not under the undisturbed vegetation or grasslands. Mean cover of Drakensberg Mountain Center endemics was highest under low grazing with or without burning. The mean cover of 8% of aliens was highest under heavy grazing and moderate or low burning. The mean range size of native grasses was highest under heavy grazing and moderate burning. So grazing is the grasslands, shrublands, and wetlands. Grazing intensity on the top row and burning intensity on the lower row. So here you can see, for example, high grazing in the grassland combined with moderate burning. Percent of response to variables tested showed that plant species richness responded to grazing, burning, slope, and percent rock. Mean percent cover in the DCM endemics responded to grazing, percent litter, and ecotype. Mean percent cover of aliens responded to temperature, seasonality, and grazing. The mean range size of native grasses at C4 responded particularly to the average annual temperature being higher, probably largely at lower elevations in our study. There's Mitzi, Jacob, and Stephen Sylvester on Ben McDwee at 3,000 meters. Jacob was out in the field every day with us, collecting frogs and crabs and whatever else and playing with his trains. We had a lot of changeable weather, and here we are in Sala Bathebi National Park in Lesotho. Thunderstorms occurred on most days during February. Here's some of the useful books and floras that we consulted. There's a recent treatment of the grasses of South Africa by Lynn Fish and Carolyn Michaud. It's published in Strelitzia. It's available electronically also. Carbon published a couple of lists of the plants of the Drakensberg with commentary on those plants. A couple of books we found very useful for identifying things other than grasses were the Elsa Pooley books, Mountain Flowers, a Guide to the Flora of the Drakensberg in Lesotho, and her book on a guide to the wildflowers of KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern region. August Schultz, Guide to the Drakensberg, provided an excellent natural history guide. There are some forests around the Drakensberg. They're very small, but they're rather sparse. There on the left, you can see a Cussonia and Protea forest. You'll find cycads and podocarps in isolated canyons and down low in the mountains. This is Cussonia, the Araliaceae, known as cabbage trees. These are sometimes cultivated in California and other places. Very strange looking trees. There's one native bamboo in the Drakensberg region. It was recently renamed as Berg Bambos tessellatus. It's the only species in the genus. There are other trees that are often more shrubby, but can get up to tree size, called Leucocidia sericea in the Rosaceae, in the tribe Sanguisorbiae. They look a lot like Polylepis from South America. There's some other strange looking plants out there, like Eucomus bicolor from the Asparagaceae. Well, that's all I have. If you got any questions, go ahead and shoot.
Rob, have any studies been done in a paleoecological sense? Say, you showed those lakes and things, that maybe pollen cores, et cetera, that show what the flora was like in the area before modern regimes of grazing and burning?
I'm not very familiar with this, but I'm informed that yes, they've done quite a bit of research on the paleo vegetation and grazing systems. There weren't many people in the Drakensberg until the British came in and forced people out of the lowlands. They moved up into Lesotho, and then lots of changes happened since then. But Lesotho was never conquered by the British because of the high walls of the Drakensberg didn't really offer much entry into the Drakensberg for the British soldiers. So Lesotho is one of the last kingdoms in Africa as a result. A lot of the native people that were up there since died out, and it's other tribes that have moved in more from the Bantu speaking peoples.
Thanks.
Not much has been done in the high Afro-Alpine in terms of research, and that's why this study was particularly important.
So, hi Rob, Ed here. I've got a question regarding the burns. Were there many burns before the people moved up there? Were there a lot of lightning burns? Is there any evidence for that?
Yeah, grasslands burn pretty readily if they've got fuel up there. And yeah, there's lightning strikes all around. We had lightning strikes almost every day in February. So yeah, there would be grass fires. And down lower, there would have been even more probably because there weren't so many people there overgrazing the terrain. but it's, I don't know about the fire record, but the whole system is adapted to fire regimes.
Yeah, you'd think so when all the orchids come in and so forth and bloom after fires. That suggests adaptation. Also, you talked about plant responses, and I'm just wondering, are your data all correlational? Does that, so you don't really have cause and effect, right? You've got statistical response variables you're talking about. Is that
Right,
going on?
right.
Okay.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, Rob.
Oh, one question is, are native grazing fauna abundant? No. We saw grazing fauna occasionally. They've mostly been hunted out. And replaced
Jill and Warren,
by sheep, cattle, and horses and goats.
Yeah, I have a question, Rob, about that plant in the asparagus family, the beautiful one that you showed last.
Yeah,
Is anything about it edible? Or is it just gorgeous?
I don't know. I didn't try.
Okay.
You see whole fields of those in protected places. I
Okay.
imagine animals graze them otherwise.
Mhm. Okay.
Rob, Ken here. How did you decide to place your plots? You had numerous small plots that you sort of grouped together, and small plots can be sort of hard. You have so many options of where to stick them. So how did you sort of decide how to place your plots?
Well, we tried to put 5 plots in each site. So we did a diversity of vegetation as we saw it in each one of those sites.
Okay.
So what about grasshoppers? I'm sorry, I might have interrupted somebody, but I would think that this is a perfect area for all kinds of grass herbivores and so forth.
Yeah, there were some interesting grasshoppers up there.
Maybe there's some new species and so forth if someone were to go up there and check it.
Have at it, Ed.
Yeah. No, I don't think I'm very mountain worthy anymore.
Rob, I have a question. How were the exotic plants introduced? Because they're at high altitude. I mean, I wonder how they got there, if they're all those exotics.
Some of them, well, different ways. Some of them were brought in for forage, like in the Tiffindale ski area. They brought in exotic grasses to plant on their ski slopes. They brought in the Festuca rubra and some other things, and probably my guess is Deschampsia cespitosa was brought in for some kind of revegetation also, because we found that at several places. The lower elevations, the Nicella and Jarava, I don't know how they come in on sheep, because they got a lot of sheep from South America, and the seeds come in and the wool on the animals, and then they take off, and they're becoming quite a problem. We found Poa nemoralis up in a high pass, and I thought, well, this is a rather strange one to be up there, and it wasn't ever reported from south of the Sierra. It was with forget-me-nots, however, along the edge of rock escarpments. It's possible people brought in wildflower seeds from Europe, and the Poa nemorales came in with that. You know, there's invasive plants can come in a whole bunch of different ways.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other question?
There's no more in the chat.
Yeah, no.
So where are all the specimens vouchered? Are they at the Smithsonian and elsewhere in Lesotho, or?
We left 2 sets in South Africa and sent the primary set to the Smithsonian.
Hmm.
And it took about a year to get exit permits. And then it finally came, and the delivery company, DHL, delivered it somewhere before Christmas. They just said they put it on a loading dock. So we didn't know where it was. Over 13 days. I was trying to figure out where the heck they'd left it.
Oh,
I finally got a call from somebody over at the Freer Museum, said they had this box. I didn't know what to do with it, but I said, oh, that's ours. So I still had to get it through plant quarantine because they hadn't taken it through plant quarantine. So I took it up to Beltsville. They examined it and said, okay, it's fine. And they handed it back to me. I took it back to the Smithsonian, put it in the freezers for a couple of weeks, and the Smithsonian gave it back to me since it wasn't logged in as an accession yet. And I have it at home. So I can study some collections for a change, since we can't get into the herbarium very often.
I just might mention there at the Botanic Garden, U.S. Botanic Garden, there was a grass exhibit, and the roots were preserved using glycerin or something like that. It was just totally amazing because the tops were there, the roots were there, and these were prairie grasses from the U.S. And some of the roots were about 8 feet long or so.
Yeah,
Preserved.
as I say, about 2/3 of the mass of a grass is underground for these perennials.
Yeah, when you said something like that earlier, that reminded me of that great exhibit.
Yeah, those are really cool. All right, everybody. Thanks for
All
coming.
right. Rob, yes, great presentation. So I guess
Welcome.
now we will meet on September